This talk really stems from my own personal revelations that come from working with cage fighters and being their doctor. It's a talk about a sport that's provocative. To some, it's a brutal, barbaric blood sport akin to human dogfighting. To others, it's sport in its most pure, honest and raw form. It's elite competition. But I'm not going to debate that today. Today, I'm going to talk about 3 lessons that I think are relevant from cage fighting to you as healthcare professionals. So it all starts here. This is Grandmaster Vora's dojo in Nottingham, in a particularly rough and unexceptional part of Nottingham. I was looking for a challenge, and I found the Grandmaster Vora was teaching Shaolin Kung Fu, and the allure of the magical martial art was very intense. I became obsessed and hooked on this, and before long I was climbing the colored belt hierarchy, learning to do the splits and to smash wooden boards with a mantis fist. I even went to Germany and came back with a hoard of trophies proving my worth. In 2002, I got my black belt from Dr. Professor Lee, that's his official title, and it was official. I was a badass. Soon after, I moved to Australia and started training with this chap, Mick Spinks, and he had a Kung Fu and MMA gym, and I taught myself up and got invited to the open sparring session and got to fight the likes of Kiro and Louis and some of their friends. And I learned a lesson. After being beaten so badly I could barely walk, fractured ribs, broken nose, broken feet, I realized that I was wrong and I was not a badass. And this was a valuable lesson about surrogate endpoints. Now this was this was going on in concert with what was being learned in the cages of North America at the time. So in 1993 in Denver, Colorado, Horian Gracie, with the help of marketer Art Davey and filmmaker John Milius, came up with the first ultimate fighting competition. This was originally an 8-man knockout competition, pitting a wide range of martial arts against one another to try to work out which martial art actually worked best. There were no rules, no weight divisions, no time limits, and they even toyed with the idea of electrifying the cage and having a moat of alligators around the outside, which they didn't do. This chap, Royce Gracie, a scrawny 178-pound Brazilian, went on to defeat a pro boxer, this muscled-up shoot fighter, Frank Shamrock, and a French Savate and kickboxer to become the first ultimate fighting champion and to prove that his martial art, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, was the most superior fighting system of the time. And this was the closest thing that had come to a clinical trial at the time. And I think this really is the first lesson from the cage. It's about surrogate endpoints. So colored belts, breaking wooden boards with your head, or eating molten lead like this chap's doing to prove that he's hard, do not translate to meaningful clinical endpoints. We've known this in critical care for years. There you go, solid. And in the classic example was in the 80s, where there was suggestion from the CAP study that antiarrhythmics improved outcomes, improved arrhythmias after myocardial infarction. Fortunately, the CAR study was done, and the CAR study showed that when they used a proper endpoint, like mortality, they realized that antiarrhythmics actually killed people, and so we didn't adopt this, and it really made a big difference. A more recent example was the Christmas study, where there was hydroxyethyl starch, Voluven, pitted against saline in patients with severe sepsis, and this study used hemodynamic stability as its endpoint, which was a bit of a ridiculous endpoint to use, but it concluded that because you need less starch than saline, starch must be better, and Voluven's arm was raised as a champion. Fortunately, Anders Perner and his crowd did the success study, and they used a meaningful clinical endpoint such as death and renal failure, showed that starch killed people and caused renal failure, and finally silenced the crowd. So be careful with surrogate endpoints. That's the first lesson. The second lesson I wanted to talk about is really about mojo. What made me think about this was watching the rise and fall of this man, Anderson the Spider Silva. So Anderson was a UFC champion, a Brazilian who is arguably the best pound-for-pound fighter that's ever lived, and he held the middleweight championship belt for longer than anyone else. But on the 6th of July, 2013, Anderson's winning streak came to an end. He was fighting a younger, less experienced opponent, and whilst he was showboating and taunting his opponent, as he usually did, he got caught. With a right hand and a left hook, the legend toppled. Up until this point, Anderson had been pretty much unstoppable, invincible, almost supernatural in the way he could effortlessly outmaneuver his opponents without getting injured. I couldn't help but wonder what the psychological burden would be like to fall from such dizzy heights. On the 28th of December the same year, he returned to the MGM Grand Garden Arena in Vegas to fight Weidman again to try to get his title back. But he was not the same fighter. He was more tentative, cautious, and he never was really in the fight. In the second round, whilst trying to kick Weidman, he got this nasty tib-fib fracture and lost the fight. And this left me wondering, what had changed from one fight to the next? Why was he a different fighter? And I think it was really about this. He'd lost his mojo. What was different? His body posture, you could see it in his body posture, his eyes, his general demeanor. He'd lost the fight before he'd even walked into the cage. Now, when I'm talking about mojo, I'm really coalescing a few concepts together of self-belief, self-confidence, mental strength, ego. I'm not really talking about the mojo that fat bastard sucked out of Austin Powers, although there are some similarities. What's this got to do with you, or got to do with critical care for that matter? Well, we all have mojo. It rises and it falls, and it affects the way we work. You'll have probably seen this in your colleagues. Maybe it's a difficult procedure that's avoided out of fear rather than better judgment. Maybe it's a decision that's deferred or a conversation avoided. Maybe it's a tube that's not put in or a tube not taken out. A difficult conflict situation avoided. Maybe you've experienced it when you've been just not in the right headspace to deal with something and just couldn't do it. I've certainly been in positions at that point in my career. And if you've not worked in a particular clinical context for a while, or you've had a bad experience at work, these things suck down and diminish your mojo. But there is good news. Mojo is something that we can work on and build. When I talk about mojo, I'm looking at the sports psychology literature a lot here, and it's really made up of two components. The innate sense of self-belief, which is largely genetically determined, and we can't really do much about that. But the second part is the evidence to an individual that they deserve to be confident. And this is something we can work on. And pro fighters and athletes do this better than anyone else. So what do they actually do to make their mojo better? Well, they don't train in isolation. They train with a team that will help build up their confidence and bring the best out of them. And if you can work with a good bunch of people, that will really make a difference. Pro fighters and Partridge practice self-talk. Now, this isn't some sort of Tony Robbins mumbo-jumbo. This is a proven way to bolster your self-confidence and ego. It's a way of quietening the voices of doubt and saying to yourself, reminding yourself of all the things you have achieved and all the things you've done well. In the words of Invictus by Henley, it's saying to yourself, I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul. Another thing fighters do well, which we can learn from, is they take complex tasks, they break them down into their individual components, and then they repetitively, obsessively drill each section of that task. A classic example was Rich Ace Franklin, the high school maths teacher turned UFC champion, who talked about this candidly at a TED Talk here in Chicago, actually. He had a fight coming up where he was going to be fighting a pro wrestler. He knew there was a good chance this guy was going to pick him up and dump him on his back, and he'd be in a position of significant disadvantage. He knew he'd have to deal with that. So he broke down the individual components of what it would take to get up from his back, up to his feet, while sustaining the minimal amount of damage. He then practiced those individual components repetitively, obsessively. When the fight came, predictably, Rich was pinned down on his back. It happened. He was in a nightmare situation. But he stayed calm, he stayed focused, and he went through the individual steps. He got back up to his feet, and his demoralized opponent went on to lose the fight. Our own Rich Levitan also advocates this. If you're taking a task such as the surgically inevitable airway, for example, if you break down the individual components of this task, if you practice the motor skill components on a cadaver or a mannequin, then when and if the time comes, you can then calmly proceed through the steps and not be fazed by it. And knowing you can do that gives you confidence. Cross-training is another thing these guys do. Another classic example was George Rush St. Pierre, another UFC champ who's undefeated. And what he did was cross-train by going to train with the Olympic wrestling team and to work on his double leg takedowns. He also went to train with elite gymnasts to develop explosive power. And then he had the edge over his competition. You can do this by cross-training in your, if you work in emergency medicine, train in intensive care medicine, do some anesthetics, work in subspecialties that are relevant to what you're doing, and that'll give you, this cross-pollination of ideas will strengthen your overall game and make you better and give you more confidence. Fighters believe in this military slogan of train hard, fight easy. They train against bigger, stronger opponents, and they push themselves from a cardio perspective and with a weights training to the absolute limits. So they know that when they step into the cage, they're making it as easy as it can possibly be. The best way we can do this, I think, is with simulation training. With simulation, you can have difficult, complex clinical scenarios. You can add in human factor problems, conflict scenarios, and you can train by doing rather than being told what to do. Of course, simulation has to be done right, but when it does, it gives you deserved self-confidence. Finally, fighters practice visualization techniques. There are only so many hours you can spend in the gym per day, but outside this time, you can amplify your training by thinking about all the permutations and combinations of situations you can find yourself in and what you're going to do in that situation. Now, you probably do this already. You probably think about what you're going to do in that can't intubate, can't ventilate, or how you'll do the escharotomy in a burns patient. But deliberate concentration on and visualization on techniques has been proven to improve performance, and if you know that, it improves confidence. Okay, the final and third lesson from the cage. So for every champion that the cage produces, there's another equally invested but largely uncelebrated figure. The coach, the mentor. In this case, Firas Zahabi for George St. Pierre. In the words of Matt and Mike, good coaches make horrible fighters decent and good fighters great. You'll remember the coaches and mentors you've had over the years, the people who've inspired you, who've given you the tools that you needed to get you where you are today. But now it's your turn. You're the next generation of coaches, but how can you get there? I'm going to argue that we should look to MMA coaches, but why should we look to MMA coaches? And for this, I'd say it's all about the stakes. For you, getting the most out of your trainees is kind of a nice idea. You want them to do well. It might even impact on patient outcomes. But for an MMA coach, if their fighter wins, they're looking at multi-million-dollar contracts, rock star notoriety, and unrivaled peer respect. If their fighter loses, they'll be pounded unconscious, and they may have a career-ending injury. So they take it very seriously, and elite coaches like MMA's Greg Jackson are one of the best in the world at this. So what do they do, and how can we learn from them? Well, first of all, they know their team. If you know your trainees, that's the first step to really bringing the best out of them. And the key to this is having good communication skills and getting to know them well. Secondly, good coaches have individualized strategies for their fighters which are specific to that fighter and that situation. Once you know your fighters, or once you know your trainees rather, you can give them strategies that play to their strengths and individualize the way you teach them, and that'll be better than just a bog standard out-the-box teaching. Good fighters know how to praise their students, praise their fighters appropriately, and they praise them when they're good. And they have ways of giving criticism and appraisal which can improve things which can be improved upon. Direct criticism kills confidence and creates failure avoiders. If you can catch them when they're good and praise them then, that creates motivated success seekers who do so much better. Good coaches are knowledgeable, but they're also passionate. They energize and inspire. Keep your passion alive. Exude genuine enthusiasm. If you can, your trainees will want to be like you, and they'll want to be better. Good coaches learn from their students as well. They're humble enough to do this, and they don't see this as a sign of weakness. And this is something you can do. Our trainees often tell us things that we don't know, and we can always keep improving our game. And as soon as you think you know it all, that's when you get caught. So keep improving. And finally, and arguably most importantly, with good coaches, it's not about them and their ego. If you genuinely want to do the best for your students and get the best out of them, then everybody wins. So there endeth the lessons from the cage. If you really want to know more about cage fighting, I'd highly recommend this book by Jonathan Gottschall, The Professor in the Cage. He was a college English professor who went on to become a cage fighter, and he gives an erudite and intellectual analysis of the sport in this book. What I do hope you take away from this are just 3 lessons. One are that surrogate markers can be dangerous. They can mislead you. Look at what was done yourself. Don't believe passionate zealots or drug companies pushing their product. 2, we all have mojo. Analyze yours and be empowered to improve it. And 3, you've all got where you are today by good coaching. Now, it's your duty to be the best mentor you can be and to inspire the next generation. Thank you.